Welcome to Qualified Opinions, where we test the ideas and limits, the knowns and known unknowns around freedom and order in contemporary politics and society. We invite you to listen as we engage with leading and emerging thinkers across disciplines and issues who will sharpen our thinking on the topics shaping our discourse. Welcome back. In a world increasingly tangled in regulatory red tape and bureaucratic inertia, many across the country have stood up to address the issue of housing shortages and affordability. In the last few years, the Yes in My Backyard movement has taken the country by storm. And now the YIMBY movement is armed with a fantastic weapon, the new comic book by Bryan Caplan called Build, Baby Build. Known for his incisive critiques of government policy and his unapologetic defense of free markets, Caplan turns to the vibrant world of graphic storytelling to advocate for a cause dear to many libertarians, cutting through the dense mess that is building regulations and housing policy that stifle innovation and inflate cost. Today, I am delighted to sit with Bryan to talk about his new book. Bryan and I go way, way back. But he's also a professor of economics at George Mason University and the New York Times bestselling author of The Myth of Rational Voters, Selfish Reason to Have More Kids, The Case Against Education, Open Borders, another comic book, and Labor versus Econ, The World. He's also a blogger at the Substack Bet On It. Welcome, Bryan.
Fantastic to be here. I hope I can live up to that introduction, Vera.
Oh, come on. You can live up to any introduction.
Oh, okay. All right.
I do know that you actually have a favorite way to introduce yourself, right? Where you talk about how you're a gamer, and do you want to give it for us?
I think you're thinking of I'm an openly nerdy man who loves graphic novels and role-playing games.
Yes. I think about that.
Although actually my favorite one is New York Times bestselling author, but hey.
Well, this is a good one. This is a very good one. So let's start. Actually, can you tell us a little bit about yourself? And you can talk about the gaming, but also how did you come to love economics?
I am a professor of economics at George Mason University. I've been here now for over half my life. I grew up in Los Angeles. I've lived on the East Coast since I was 22. Where I went to Princeton, and then I got hired at George Mason by the power of Tyler Cowen and been here ever since. How did I become an economist? Just the actual story is when I was 17, a friend of mine gave me Atlas Shrugged to read. It was this crazy book saying that you could have a free market in everything. It was nice poetry, but well, is that actually true? I was always taught it would be a complete disaster. And that's what got me reading economics. I started reading the Austrian economists, who were the economists most likely to say that Rand was right. They're also unsurprisingly the ones that she recommended. That's where I started. But then as an undergraduate, I actually learned what I'll call real economics. Okay, so it's quite a bit more complicated. But I would say that it's the kind of thing where you say, okay, what's more complicated? And then it's even more complicated than that. And then it's pretty much it was right the first time. Right now I'm working on a new non-graphic novel, a non-graphic book. It's called Unbeatable, The Brutally Honest Case for Free Markets. And this is one where I'll say it's my most mature view of economics, which is that, yes, all of the complaints that you hear about in the textbook are totally sensible about free markets. They're also barely relevant to anything government actually does because governments aren't implementing the textbook. Rather, what's going on is they're doing a bunch of terrible stuff that sounds good. And then, unfortunately, most econ textbooks writers and most economists, instead of using their eyes and saying, well, what is government really doing? And how does this map on to what we recommended? They basically act as apologists and say, well, this policy exists for this good reason. This policy exists for this good reason. That's not what's really going on.
And this is actually a good segment to your new book, because this is one of the things that you look at. And so the book is called Build, Baby Build, The Science and Ethics of Housing Regulation. And so first, let me ask you, so this is not, as I said, your first book. so I mean, you've written so on housing regulation, immigration. You made the case for having more children, the end of higher education subsidies, all of things I totally agree with you. I wish I kind of
You're a perspicacious person, Vera.
I know. Well, you know. But how do you pick these topics?
It really comes down to this.
What's the Caplan method?
The Caplan method. Let's see. Well, let me quote one of the great Frenchmen, Moliere. Let's see. And the English translation, I can only do the English translation, not speaking French, but maybe you know the French by heart. It's so cool. So here's the line from this in the probe. Men, sir, are always out of reason, and that's the reason why righteous anger's never out of season.
That's a very good one. Yeah. I wasn't expecting that.
Yeah, so what motivates me is when I see some big issue where I just think people are wrong. Yes. That's the start. It's got to be big, and most people have to be wrong.
So
and then it's like, well, can they really be that wrong? And then I read more and more. No, they're really wrong. They're really wrong. It's got to be stopped. Like, that's the idea. And it's got to be a topic where hardly anybody else cares or is working on it. Or at least where everybody else, it's just like, you're not getting it right. You're not saying it right. It comes down to, if there's some really important book where I feel like if I don't do it, Frodo, no one will. And that's when I do it.
So basically, now that you've brought Frodo into it, it means that basically the stakes are really high.
Yes. Like it's like either you destroy the One Ring or Sauron wins.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, I'm not crazy enough to think that writing a book automatically solves a problem or even has more than a very tiny chance of solving the problem. But I guess on some level, it's like, look, until I write this book, people have an excuse for persisting in what they're doing. And once the book's written, then, all right, now it's like the book's been written. Now, like, come on. Like, I've laid it out so clearly. I've answered all the objections. Yield.
Yes, and then you deploy an army, right? You make a fellowship, and people can use your book and then go fight the battle.
Yeah, I mean, I can hope, and at least people read my books.
Yeah.
Most academics can't even say that.
Yes, that is true. Bestseller, New York Times bestseller. And one of the things that's really great about your book is that you actually take complicated literature, not just from economics, actually. Like, for instance, your book about having more children. I mean, it draws from enormous different field, and you make it very comprehensive. Well, first it's comprehensive, but it's also, you make it very
comprehensible,
very easy, comprehensible. Yeah, the comprehensive came from that was the French, and I realized that was one of those false friends. So why comic books? Because you were doing very well with words and no pictures, and now we get both.
Right. I mean, here's the story there. Like, you go and you write a book, and you feel like you've done a good job, and then it's like, yeah, it doesn't seem like many people are reading it. I mean, like all of my books, I'm always thinking, okay, I want this to be a book where cutting edge research in the field will have to go and engage with it and say that it's up to high quality standards. But I also want to broaden the audience to, as much as I can. But for my other books, I say sort of like the range of the readers goes from active researchers in my specialized topic all the way down to what I'll call the good undergraduate, or someone who was a good undergraduate, journalist, someone who's a layman, but they're intellectually engaged. And that's the best that I can do with my university press books. I just said the idea, I want to do better than that. I want to expand more. I want to also just get more time. There are some famous bestsellers that we've got independent data indicating almost no one ever read them, like Stephen Hawking's A Brief History of Time. I think there's like some kind of audit, and it turned out that almost no one who bought the book read it. Where you buy it and give it to someone else, and like, yeah, great, I own Stephen Hawking. Now it can sit on my shelf forever. So I'm just I'm trying to think of ways to go and actually get people to open the book, read it, to engage with it, and to get more readers. And that's where I had this idea of, well, maybe if I did it as a nonfiction graphic novel, that's the technical term for it. I was inspired by Larry Gonick's Cartoon History of the Universe series. And especially, it's not just that it's so funny and so engaging, so you really want to read it. And then on top of it, by combining words and pictures, you really can communicate a lot more information per minute of time. The other thing that was cool about it is it was accurate. Like any area of history that I knew, I'd say Gonick was basically correct. So why not go and use this format to accurately convey a lot more information to a lot more people in a lot less time? So that's what inspired Open Borders, and I thought I'd do it again.
Yeah, and so you collaborated with a graphic artist. Do you want to tell us a little bit about him?
Yeah, so this is a Romanian artist named Ani Bronze. I just found him on the internet. I was giving him some projects, and I really liked his stuff. And I said, hey, do you want to go and draw an entire book with me? Actually, his most notable works before are doing the iconography in Eastern Orthodox churches in Romania and some surrounding areas. So that's actually his main thing. He's done both painting and sculpture, actually. So anyway,
and in fact, it kind of shows a little in your Panacea chapter.
Yep.
I mean, I guess I didn't know that background information about him, but I thought it was kind of interesting because, so in the Panacea chapter, it comes through, I guess.
Right. So the style that we settled on for this is we want to do classic Disney homage. So 1930s, Snow White, Cinderella, Sleeping Beauty, these totally beloved classic pictures. So that's the style that we're shooting for throughout. So actually, the main indication of his religious iconography, if you go to the end notes, there's a scene of the angel, like some archangel casting Adam and Eve out of the Garden of Eden, but instead I turned it into the bureaucrat character is the angel casting the potential home buyers out of Adam and Eve out of the housing market. So that was one where I'm like, okay, let's show Audie's religious artistic background.
Yeah, but with a serpent, I thought that was
the serpent. Yes,
the serpents. I mean,
yes, the serpent's panacea. But I think you're right. So that is kind of a cool satanic image that I wasn't even consciously thinking about it, but you're right. Yeah.
See. So the thing that's also really great about the books, and I guess it's really important to mention it, is like you don't dumb it down. It's like you make it really very easy to read, but you don't dumb it down entirely. There's a lot of numbers in there, and it's all based on academic studies. And in fact, there's a long site. There are lots of reference for each chapter. I mean, it's done in a very academic style. So basically, people who wanna go and learn more about and go read the academic articles that are just based on and so this is actually one of the things that I find really the most impressive. Is like you feel you basically you chew all the work for us and you make it very entertaining without kind of dumbing it down to the point where we actually don't know whether it's trusting. It's trusted.
The verb I like is distill. I distill the academic work. I don't dumb it down. I try to go and give a very short, simplified version of what the work is really saying and what it means without saying anything that is false. And then in the notes, if you want to go and get the details, they're there. So I've got not only the academic references, but I do have endnotes explaining, for example, where the math is coming from, what the calculations are. One of the hardest challenges in the book is that right before the book was about to come out, there was a very serious critique of a famous paper by Shea and Moretti. And I'm like, oh God, what am I going to do? We don't even have time to redraw this. So what I wound up doing is just adding in a sign at that part of the book saying, warnings, there's some new evidence has come to light. And then in the endnotes, I go over the whole drama of what's happened. And also what it means for the argument. I don't think that it is anything that is crucial for the argument. It's important for Shea and Moretti personally, but that's just one brick in an edifice.
Yeah, well, we're going to talk about this. So let's start. So can you just, since their words I still can't say. Bryan has known me since I've arrived in this country, and he can tell you that my English has improved quite dramatically, and yet there are still words I can't say. So anyway, can you tell us describe how do we see that there are problems with the housing market? I'll put market in quotes.
Right. I mean, here's the thing. If you just take a look at the world, you might say, oh, well, I don't know. Is there a problem? Is there not a problem? Sure, it's really expensive to live in the nicest places, but that's generally true that nice stuff costs more money. Isn't that just the free market at work? The answer, though, turns out to be no, it's not just the free market at work, because when you look a bit more closely, you realize, well, wait a second, right? It's not merely that it costs a lot of money to live in downtown Manhattan because it's nice. There's also this strange fact that what is the normal market adjustment of just building a massive supply of anything that is in high demand hasn't happened. And like, why not? Right. And in particular, you go and you take a look at like New York City, it's like, we have these skyscrapers, large share of which were built like 100 years ago. And then you go to other parts where prices are sky high and they're not building any skyscrapers. Like, I wonder what's going on. Why not? Right. So anyway.
I mean, in the book, you have a number that is striking. That I think it's like between 1989 and 2001, no skyscrapers were built in the U.S. And since then,
not the U.S., San Francisco.
In San Francisco, sorry, but ever since. But it's still, quite amazing.
And then they said, okay, we're going to be kind. We're going to let you do one per year.
One per year. And the reason why it is so striking is because what effectively the book shows is that it's not just supply and demand. Mm-hmm. In areas where actually the demand is really high, where you would think that then there's a strong incentive to create a lot of supply, that is not happening.
Right. So anyway, this is where the academic research comes in. So there's academics says, it seems kind of weird. And then they realize, all right, so there's a bunch of regulations that make it really hard, right? So it's hard to get permission to build a skyscraper today. 100 years ago, it was easy. It really was. Just knock down whatever you want, build whatever you want practically. You got a few permits back then, but it barely mattered. And then they noticed, wow, like just want to build an apartment complex. 80% of the residential land in America is set aside for single family homes. Even if all you want to do is build a single family home, there is normally a minimum lot size and it's a lot of land. You got to go and put like a full acre of land in a lot of places in America now, often even more than that. So then there's like, all right, there's a bunch of regulation. Maybe that has something to do with why there's not that much getting built. Anyway, then some economists said, all right, well, how can we measure this? So Ed Glazer and Joe Jerko had the idea of, well, how about we do it like this? We go and we compare homes that are otherwise very similar, but some have a little bit more land. And this gives us an idea, what is like the raw value of just some land that you can't really do anything on? Just add on 100 square feet of vacant land. You can't put another thing there. You probably couldn't get permission even if you wanted to. And this will give us an idea of what is the raw value of land without permission attached. It's think of it as land minus paperwork. What's that worth? And then they found that there are construction manuals that actually give you construction costs, and people in the industry use it to get an idea about what construction costs will be. So then they added up the raw value of land plus construction cost and compared it to price. And that's where they said, my God, right? It's something like averaging over the US, the price of housing is at something like double its physical cost of construction. Right. Initially, they did this and they said, well, it's basically a problem in the most desirable areas. The rest of the country doesn't matter much. But then subsequently, they got some better data and they realized, oh, wait, actually, it's Jerko who got the data. Glazer wasn't involved in the Layton paper. So they realized, okay, so actually, like almost all downtowns, no matter how allegedly loose the city is, almost all downtowns actually have a lot of regulation matters a lot. And then as you move away from the city center, sometimes the regulation starts to matter not very much. Other times it keeps mattering. So for example, in LA or San Francisco, the regulation just matters like 50, maybe even 100 miles away from the city center. On the other hand, Chicago is a place where there's terrible regulation in the immediate downtown. 30 miles away, then it's not so important anymore. So, but the bottom line is that almost everywhere where people want to live has a lot of regulation. You could go and build another Empire State Building in the middle of Kansas if you wanted to, or middle of nowhere, Kansas, but nobody wants to go and build an Empire State Building in the middle of nowhere in Kansas. So the regulation is actually quite stifling, quite draconian.
So is this specific to America?
Great question. So the cop-out answer is we don't know because almost all research is based on the U.S. Okay. Right? And that's just the general fact of social sciences that there's 10 times as much research on the U.S. as any other country. But I think that once you understand how the U.S. works, if you look at other countries, it's pretty clear that almost all countries have bad regulation. The U.K. is almost certainly worse than the U.S. France is almost certainly worse than the U.S. The details matter because Europe isn't as bad on the multifamily.
Yeah.
It's a lot easier to go and build apartments in Europe than it is to build them in the US.
But also look, I mean, for instance, Paris, right? They decided to make a trade-off where they want to preserve the beauty of the buildings, the face of the buildings. But inside you can do literally anything you want. There's a lot of mixed use, which arguably is much better than what they do in New York, where there's not a lot of mixed use, where you can't, when you go in Paris and I'm not advocating for the regulation in France, but I mean, in some ways, there are like things that and they're doing slightly better. You can go to any like classified building and you'll find apartments, and in apartments you'll find like a doctor's office. It's
So like, I mean, I don't want to be an American chauvinist here and say the U.S. is the best. It's not like it's got, it's worse in some ways.
No. America is the best
so,
overall.
Say like Paris, your big problem is historic preservation.
No.
Right. So that's, and then if you go other places, so probably, Europe generally historic preservation is, definitely a bigger issue than multifamily, because multifamily is a lot easier than it is here. I mean, I think that Europe is also even worse than the U.S. generally for skyscrapers. You got some skyscrapers, but in Paris, but you got to get like 20 miles outside of the city center, something like that, right?
Yeah, and DC as a height limit. So let's talk. So you
right. And by the way, like the crazy thing is, it's not just first world countries. India has terrible regulation, and you're like, you've got people sleeping on the streets, and yet you're making it hard to build stuff. And it's like, well, we wouldn't want to go and allow the wrong kind of building. Like, whatever, just build anything. I can't believe how stubborn you're being about this, and that you can get elected in India while strangling this basic necessity. But once you understand that this is not about objective self-interest, as I say in the book, this is just about economic illiteracy, innumeracy, paranoia, status quo bias. That's the real problem. Those are the real problems. Right?
So can you kind of give us like obviously not an exhaustive list, but like what are the main housing regulation that actually constrains the supply?
Right. So for the U.S., I've already mentioned the big ones. So you've got hard to build tall buildings, hard to do multifamily, minimum lot size. The one that I haven't mentioned, which turns out to matter a lot, is parking requirements. There's this great book by Donald Shoup, The High Cost of Free Parking. It's the absolutely best 800-page book you'll ever read on parking. But I'm not even kidding. It's a good book. You're like, wow, I can't believe how bad parking is. Like it is just full of these facts where you never think about them, but when you read it, it's like, like there's one of like in a downtown, something like a third of the cars in the street are people driving around looking for parking.
Yeah.
It's like, if we just solved the parking problem, we would make a huge dent in the traffic problem. And it's like, oh, it's so hard to solve the parking problem. It's not. Raise the price. Raise the price. Don't let people park for free. Don't make it a nickel per hour. Don't say you can only park for 2 hours. Say like you park, like here's the price. Park as long as you want. Who cares?
Well, and then there's a lot of parking sharing now, apps that have actually come online, which to me has resolved a lot of the issue with parking without spending hours. But I mean, the parking requirements is also is a big problem. For instance, for the cost of childcare, that's one that if you're going to have a childcare business, you have also in cities requirements that you should have as many parking for people who are stopping like literally for like a second. And that apparently is a big, I mean, it's one of the many things that supply childcare.
Right. So what she points out is that the standard parking law in the US for businesses is they want you to have enough spaces so that all of your customers, 100% of your customers, can park there on the busiest day of the year if you charge them a price of $0. That's the standard. So if you take a look at a mall and you realize, wow, there's always tons of parking here. Yeah, that's because the parking regulations are based upon how many people will be here on Thanksgiving, on Black Friday, the day after Thanksgiving, right? And even if you go to a mall the day after Thanksgiving, often there's spare parking, But so and what this means is that you're burning up a whole lot of spaces that are vacant 364 days of the year, which could have been used to build something else.
Yeah. So what are like the best measure that we have of price hike? You mentioned it, but also there are the cost of housing regulation is not just higher prices, even that's a big deal. You list in the book all sorts of other ways it impacts. It has really big impacts on things that we don't think about. And for instance, you cite low fertility rates, inequality. Can you talk about these two in particular?
Yeah. I mean, honestly, this is why I wrote the book. If all I had to say was there's terrible housing regulation, it's raised the price of housing a lot, we should deregulate and get cheaper housing, that's not really a book. It's too short. And like, it's pretty obvious when you think about it. What was cool to me and inspired me is realizing there's a lot of issues that seem unrelated, where people often think of the issues themselves as these are problems that are just intractable. What can we do? So not only is there something we can do, there's one thing we can do that would simultaneously make a big dent in a whole bunch of problems. Right. So actually, here's one that has a nice French flavor. All right, inequality. So Thomas Piketty is very famous for the stuff on capital's income shares rising. And then there's this famous paper by Ron Lee, where he says, look, it's true that capital share has been rising in a bunch of countries since World War II, but it's not the Piketty story of capital is feeding on capital and the interest rates exceeding the rate of economic growth, leading capital to get a growing share of the economy. Ron Lee said the real story is just that housing is heavily regulated and housing has increased as a share of income by a lot. And if you subtract out the housing, then there's been no change in the capital share since World War II. Right. So it's like, So if you're concerned about the rising capital share or concerned about rising inequality more generally, how about we just deregulate housing and forget about all this other stuff that Piketty's pushing of more progressive taxation, blah, blah, blah. But also it gives you a very different picture. There's one furthermore, when you think about it a bit more, it's like, So of course, deregulating housing makes it cheaper for everyone. Your money goes further, whether you're rich or poor. But since housing is a classic example of a necessity, it's something where the poor spend a larger share of their income on it than the rich, and therefore they get a larger percentage boost if you cut the price. Right? And then similarly, of course, tenants are poorer than owners. So there's another reason why there's a bigger boost for the poor rather than the rich. So this is a bona fide case where deregulation would go and increase equality. So people are complaining about inequality. All right, great. Let's deregulate and we can get cheaper housing. We get more equality. It's like another one similarly. So there's a lot of complaining about just low social mobility. All right, well, there's this great paper by Ganong and Shoag where they say, well, there used to be a really easy way for poor Americans and really poor people in almost any country to just get a raise and get a higher standard of living, which is just get in your car, pack your stuff, and move to a higher wage part of your own country. Then they point out it doesn't work anymore, at least in the United States, because now the extra housing cost will be more than 100% of your wage gain. For a janitor from Mississippi to move to San Francisco, it used to be a way for that janitor to get a lot richer. Now it's a way for him to get a lot poorer. Because, he will get more money as a janitor in San Francisco, but the housing cost is so astronomical that he gets poorer overall in terms of actual standard of living. All right, so that's another issue where this stuff makes a dent. You mentioned fertility. All right, now this one is a bit more controversial, and I will just be honest and say there's only about 4 papers that I could find on it, but I'll say the papers that I found are consistent with this story, and I think it's pretty simple overall. It's this. One of the main reasons why people keep living with their parents into their 30s is because housing's so expensive. Right? And if you look at it like a map of Europe, this totally fits. And then if you're living with your parents, you're really unlikely to get married. And you're especially unlikely to go and start having kids if you're living with your parents. Double duh. All right, so we could go and make housing cheaper than it would indeed raise fertility. This is what the few papers around say. The only real doubt here is people saying, well, but if you go and allow people to get cheaper living in cities, this will raise population density. And there's some well-known papers saying density is bad for fertility. Here I'd say, well, hold on. Is it density is bad for fertility or expensive housing is bad for fertility?
Yeah. I mean, how do you, in the current context, how do you know?
Yes. Right. So anyway, I actually just read the really hot paper right now, and they don't have any measure of prices. So I'd say like a minimum is totally consistent with the real that if we just make housing cheaper, then people will get larger places, and then larger places, we should expect it to raise fertility. And in fact, we got some papers saying that it would.
So, I mean, I had heard the argument that density actually could be hurting fertility. But when I heard this argument and I didn't look at the literature at all, what I thought is, what is the place in the world that has high density and in a completely deregulated or as much as possible deregulated housing environment? And I didn't really think of one, because that's where you could measure it. Like right now, like you look at places that are highly dense, because there are places where people want to live, and that's where you have the most housing regulations, right? So I don't know how you.
So like the best example of a place where regulation's pretty light is Japan, right?
Yeah.
Although I mean, like they're so here's the thing, like for any one country, it's always easy to say this country proves my case or the country's meaningless. Yeah. And the reasonable thing is every country counts a little bit. Always consider that. I mean, so was actually going over this very famous paper that's gotten a lot of attention on something like 171 countries. There's something where people that are citing the paper, like, I don't think they're actually reading it, because the paper uses national population density to measure population density. So just by definition, it's got nothing to do with urbanization. And so they didn't, I don't think they even controlled for that. I mean, here's the thing is that the right measure of density is actually pretty complicated. So you could say, like, is Russia densely populated? By nationally, totally not. And yet they've got a large share of the population living in a couple of big cities. So then by that measure it is. So anyway, there's something, I would say that the totally reasonable default is make housing cheaper. People will then be able to spread out and afford larger places, and that will raise the fertility very likely, though, of course, we can't be absolutely certain.
So let's talk about what are the goals that regulators are hoping to achieve with all these housing zoning rules and land use and single family use. What's the goal that are stated?
Yeah. I mean, I'd say that like every regulation is based upon a sense that the world would be worse without the regulation. I don't think much of this actually is people just craftily going and trying to pile up their goal like Scrooge McDuck. Like as I say, there's like very good evidence. Tenants generally favor regulation too. It's something that humans favor. It's not specifically homeowners or anything like that. I don't think the regulatory capture story is very good. In fact, I would say that this is a great example of an industry where without special interests, without developers constantly whining and dining regulators in order to get permission, we might not build anything. Right? Again, the lobbying is like the lobbying of industry is like, thank God you're lobbying these guys because that's the only way anything gets built.
But so that's interesting because Matt Mitchell, who used to work at Mercatus, always said that behind every government granted privilege, or and that includes supply restrictive regulations and subsidies and stuff, there's a special interest, right?
Yeah.
And so you're saying that's not actually the case?
Yeah. Well, I mean, here's the thing: is that normally a developer doesn't plan on owning the property; they're going to sell it.
Who are the biggest opponent of deregulation, of housing deregulation? I mean, homeowners who it seems they seem to be really benefiting from the artificial increase of prices of their property because of the zoning, right?
Right. So here's the thing is we've got public opinion where we compare owners and tenants, and it's complicated, but at least at first pass, it's very standard for tenants to also be highly supportive of housing regulation.
Yeah, that's right. You have a number in there. I was stunned. You said 60%. Well, it was based on a 2018 paper. 62% of renters are in favor of banning any new development, but only 40%.
Yeah,
it seems so counterintuitive.
Yeah, well, so it's not counterintuitive to me because my first book, The Myth of Rational Voter, is all based on the idea that objective self-interest barely matters in politics. Well, I'm going to say it's based upon the empirical fact, right? Which is not just me. It's almost everyone who's looked at the facts agrees with this stuff. The only people who think that people vote their objective self-interest are dogmatic people who do models and don't look at actual human beings. People vote on the basis of their half-baked philosophies. It's philosophy. It's not very good philosophy. It's not very thoughtful, but it is philosophy. It's not some plot to go and squeeze as much gold as you can out of the system. right? So like some of the best evidence we have on what's really going on with regulation, who really supports it, is this great book called Neighborhood Defenders, where they actually got the transcripts of almost every land use meeting in the state of Massachusetts. And like, what do people say in the meetings? First of all, of course, the people that go to the meetings are so weird. They're not normal people. These are people with problems. these are angry people, paranoid people, but they're talkers. They're vocal, right? And it's all based upon complaining. And what do they complain about? Do they say, this project will reduce my home price by 3%. It must be stopped. They don't say anything like that. They say, there's a bird's nest. Don't you care about the birds? His name is Harry, and he'll have no place to live if you allow this $1 billion skyscraper. That's like a typical thing that happens at these meetings. And then you'd say, okay, they're cleverly concealing their desire to go and make an extra $1,000 behind some story about a bird named Harry. This seems really far-fetched to me.
No, so some of the arguments I've heard, right? I mean, when I talk, because this is kind of one of my favorite things to do. I mean, all my non-work friends are very, very liberal in Arlington, and they're all like, against inequality. They're all, for Black lives, for all of this. They're all good thinking. And I said, well, would you be in favor of housing deregulation and zoning against single family, stuff? And they're no, of course not, because and then of course I tell them, well, then you're really not against inequality. I mean, I like teasing them like this. And but their arguments is always, we'll need more schools. Also, they do say it would lower the value of my property. They do say,
Is that the main thing they say? Because so my experience, you only get here's the thing is, so we actually have this great study just asking people, what do you think?
That it's going to deface the neighborhood.
Yeah, there's that.
Which I find really funny.
How about just, you're the ideologue, Vera, for thinking this would reduce prices? It's just going to be some rich fat cats making money, tearing down nice neighborhoods, destroying them to get rich.
No, but so the defacing the neighborhood always makes me laugh because, all of our houses are mostly built in 1940. So coming from France, I kind of find that it's kind of funny. Like, we absolutely want to preserve, this 1940 style of housing.
Yeah.
I
guess France doesn't have that much from the 1940s due to the war and all. Right?
Yeah. But,
maybe Vichy France is okay.
Yeah. But I do hear, right? I mean, these type of complaints. And of course, I mean, at the national level, you hear arguments that are like, we know relatively bunk, like about, in fact, for the environment is completely bunk. Like, it's like more buildings mean hurting the planet. And you talk about this in your book. And so I hear arguments like this. So for instance, like the environmental argument, actually, you say that building more would be more environmental. Can you go into that?
Let me do that. Let me just back up real quickly.
Yeah.
So, two awesome papers. So there's one paper, I'm forgetting the authors, but basically they just went in and asked people, so what do you think would happen if your city allowed builders to build 10% more housing, to increase the stock by 10%? And responses are roughly a third say it would reduce prices, a third say it would make no difference, a third say it will increase prices. It's just abject economic illiteracy. Roughly 2/3 of people just deny the basic fact that more housing will lower prices. So yeah, like if that's your worldview, then I understand why you're against housing deregulation. Is like, what good would it do? Now, there's also a great paper by my friend Michael Manville at UCLA, where he actually gave people two hypotheticals. One said, would you approve the following development project? The other one, would you approve exactly the same project if the developer would make a lot of money on it? And just saying the developer would make a lot of money drops support for like 20 or 30 percentage points. So much of this is just based upon resentment of business and the rich, like those greedy fat cats just making a pile of money, right? And it's like, do you get mad at farmers for making money, making food? Like, why are you so hateful towards these people? They're providing a fundamental basic good that everybody needs. It's not like cigarettes. It's not like heroin. Like, everybody needs to have a place to live. So, like, why are you demonizing the people that do it for us?
Is the opinion in favor of housing regulation, does it vary depending on the area where you poll people? So, for instance, if it's an area where housing is cheap, did it change the way they think about housing regulation?
So I don't remember any paper giving really solid information on that. So definitely my impression is that places with low regulation, people don't appreciate it. They just sort of take it for granted that housing's cheap, like in Texas. No normal Texas goes around saying, I'm so proud to be in Texas where housing regulation's low, so we can still enjoy the American dream. They may say the last part of Texas, you can still enjoy the American dream, but it's more by default. Right now on environmental effects, here there's this great paper by Ed Glazer and Matt Kahn, and Matt Kahn has actually done more stuff on this as well, where they just go and do some very basic arithmetic on what's going on with regulation and different measures of environmental quality. And the punchline is this. First of all, the most regulated areas are really like temperate California stands out. And as a result, housing is really expensive in California, which doesn't mean that human beings cease to exist. It means that people don't go to California, or they leave California and they live someplace else where their environmental footprint is higher, because California is naturally great weather. And so you don't need to go and use much electricity for heating and cooling. Whereas if you go to other places, you'll use more. So Californians basically comes down to, we don't want the planet to be harmed in California. We want it to be harmed a lot more someplace else.
Yeah, because I remember that Glazer paper where basically it says like they're going to go and build somewhere else because if people can't find homes, they're going to have to live somewhere.
Right. And then a very cool thing they find is so new construction is greener. It's better insulated. So, and this is despite the fact that new housing is bigger. It's bigger and greener.
And I would say I was thinking about this when you were talking about the skyscraper thing.
Urban living also smaller footprint.
I mean, and so there's, but it's also, you would think that the technology has improved over the last 100 years. So we've had the technology for over 100 years, but the technology's got to be better now.
Sure.
You gotta be able to actually build higher, safer, have better and faster ways to go from the first floor to the 250 floors or whatever. I don't know what the highest skyscraper.
I think it's still Burj Khalifa, so I think that's 163.
Oh, it's still really high.
Yeah. I mean, honestly, when you do see a super tall building that being built in New York, probably it wouldn't be quite as high if it weren't for the regulations. If I can get permission, given how expensive everything here is, I want to do whatever I can get away with. But if you could build a lot, prices be lower, and then it's okay, well, we don't want to go and pay this enormous premium to go over 40 stories or over 50 stories. So, I mean, probably, right now, I think I show there's this one famous new skyscraper built just south of Central Park. Everything else is 6 stories. So if you could go to 40 stories, probably it would just be ringed with a bunch of 40-story buildings, and that would be the end of it. And you wouldn't be seeing these super tall structures. And the prices just have to get a lot higher for that to be justified, especially to do it commonly. If you do one, then maybe it's a tourist site or whatever, but you're not going to go and do 300 of them for tourist attractions.
And I assume that the housing prices are affected. It's not just one regulation that is affecting the price. It's accumulation of all sorts of regulation, right? And so some of them which have nothing to do with constraining it's not housing specific, but it's, for instance, all the environmental regulation. And so can you give us some examples of some of the regulations that are not directly that are just more regular building or construction hindering regulation that are also basically having an impact on the price of housing?
Yeah, well, you really get out of this great book, Neighborhood Defenders, is just the sheer cost of delay.
Yes.
Right. So imagine that you knew that after 10 years of fighting it out with zoning boards and the courts, you would definitely get permission to build what you wanted. That could still easily get you say, I don't want to go and spend 10 years. There's just the time value of money. It's not going to be profitable. If I have to wait 10 years to go and actually do this stuff, plus all of the costs of going through 10 years of legal hoops. So what they show there is that a lot of stuff just gets dragged on. You say, okay, we need another study. The study takes a year. And then at the end, the people that want to block it say, well, the study wasn't done quite right. We demand another study.
Yeah.
And you just keep doing that and kicking the can down the road another year. There's the cost of the study, but there's just the delay, sheer delay. Yeah. So that is a really big deal. There is sometimes for single family homes is what's called by right construction, where if you meet the rules, then the government must approve you.
Mm-hmm.
right? And there is some new deregulation in Florida where DeSantis, I think he actually did get it passed, where basically local governments, they have to give you an answer within a fairly short amount of time. And if they don't give you an answer, automatic yes. So that means they've got to really, of course they could just stamp everything no. So, and I'm not sure how it's playing out, but it is the idea of just putting a fire under them. So they've got to go and essentially, when their own rules start to go and be a problem for the people making the rules, right? So always a good thing to do to a bureaucrat is just to give them a taste of what it's like to be the regulatee. It's like it's unreasonable to expect me to get this done on time. Yeah, well, it's unreasonable to go and have your rules in the first place. So now you can get a taste of your own medicine.
I mean, it's kind of striking. Like, for instance, the bridge that collapsed in Maryland, near us, it was built in 5 years at the time where they had technology that was just much not as developed as what we have. And now the estimation is that it's going to be not only just much more expensive, but also take at least 10 years.
Yep.
And that's with the government, like just saying that they're super in favor of it going fast, right? It's like the cost. I mean, we've made a choice for stagnation in this country. Yes. And not only is it like it takes so long to build anything, but as a result, there's just a lot of things we don't buy. I mean, like the example I always think about is like, I remember when I was growing up, there was a Concorde going from Paris to New York in 4 hours, and we don't have this anymore. Now,
he's working for some supersonic company, but I don't know if he's making any progress.
Well, so he used to work for Boom. Now he's left because I think it was, I don't know why he left, but now he works for
he solved the problem, and now supersonic's happening.
Well, he works for the abundance agenda, and part of also the things that the abundance agenda really works on is like housing deregulation. So in your dream world, Bryan, so housing deregulation happens, but the first step, right, has to be economic education, right? Is that the first step, or an education? And then if you have to do, just kind of get people to understand, do you focus on legislators, or do you focus on, home owners? Like, do you tell Democratic voters that if they really care about income inequality, they should actually care about housing deregulation? How do you go about it?
Yeah, great question. I mean, what I say is, everybody who works in the area of ideas has a comparative advantage, and you should focus on that. Like, I'm not the right person to go and tell Democrats what they should think. They're not going to trust me. They're not going to like me. What I would hope rather is that the left-wing NIMBYs, they'll read me, they'll like me, and they will then go and say, like, I'm a Democrat in good standing. I check all the right boxes. But on this particular issue, this is what I think, and that's going to work a lot better. In terms of like the most likely route, I'll say that over time I've been more and more convinced that political leaders have a lot of slack. There's just a lot of issues where most people barely care about them, and a person with the right amount of charisma can just go and do amazing things. Could be amazingly good or amazingly bad, and get away with them. Right now, they may so often they're cautious, but then there's people that are not. I mean, so the case of DeSantis, like when he went and got rid of almost all COVID regulation quite early, I would say there's no sign that Floridians were actually on board with that. He did it and nor was it the case that he had a huge electoral victory margin. It was barely anything. But seemed like he was just sincerely convinced this would be a good policy, and also that he could sell it somehow. Mm-hmm. Right? And that's the point, that he could sell it somehow. Not that it was the easiest sell, not that it was what the public was ready for, but like, I can get away with this. And he did it, and he got away with it. And I think the same thing is happening with red states that are getting rid of DEI right now. I don't think it was the case the typical voter in Texas or Florida was waking up in the morning saying, like, crush DEI, crush DEI. It was rather that the intellectuals managed to get politicians excited about it. And then politicians realized, well, look, this might not be that easy. There might not be a lot of demand for it, but I could get away with it. Right? And so people that are going and directly to political leaders and just saying, like, here's a great idea and you can get away with it. Here, you've got the charisma, go for it. Honestly, I think that is the most likely scenario for it to work. So, and again, of course, working with the judiciary as well. In the book, I have a picture of all 9 Supreme Court justices having a copy of my book and hoping to get them to go and overturn the constitutionality of local regulation. So again, that is a long shot, but just to chip away at it, say, well, this one's unreasonable, that one's unreasonable, and basically get the slippery slope working the other way. Of course, if you are someone that teaches Econ 1 at Harvard, Jason Furman, then yeah, go and assign my book. And these people are going to be influential in the future and try to change their minds, make sure that they know the basic economics there, Jason Furman. But
and actually, I'm thinking as you're talking, I'm thinking this may be one of the areas where actually, if you're right that legislators are like basically entrepreneur legislator who wants to do, I mean, this is one of the cases where actually the polarization may help.
Yeah.
because if you're going to be voting for R or D, no matter what they do, no matter what they say, no matter how bad they are, then it means that basically the legislators could go and do really good things without caring, or really bad things, unfortunately. Yeah. And unfortunately, their instincts are often to do very bad things. But maybe polarization would help actually in getting a lot of the stuff we want. But
yeah, so totally. I mean, the weird thing is that the YIMBY movement is actually very left-wing. It is not true that leftists in general are YIMBY. That's important. So, again, Matt Kahn is another piece showing that it's the left-wing cities in California are the worst on regulation. Which makes sense. Of course, like in general, left-wing people like government, don't like markets, but somehow like the YIMBYs have carved out this niche, and they're punching way above weight. So great, right? And they just are more. They're more articulate at the state level. They might not be as good at a local meeting, but in terms of going to the state legislature and saying what's best for the future of our state, is it to go and listen to the guy who's upset about Harry the Bird? Or is it that we should go and try to let people build a lot of stuff?
Montana actually has had a lot of really big success deregulating housing, apparently.
Good to know. So I missed Montana.
Yeah. There was a story in the Atlantic, and that was actually led a lot by free market people in Montana. And so it's a pretty remarkable story. But let me ask you this. So a lot of those regulations were state and local. Is there anything apart from having the 9 Supreme Court justices not only buying your book, reading your book, and understanding and loving your book, is there anything that can be done at the federal level?
Plenty. So, I mean, the simplest one is federal government says we're withholding money until you deregulate. They can totally do that. Another one that's pretty striking is that in the 60s,
I've actually have issues with this. I mean, this is ideas that I've seen floated by other people, like CDBG grants, like have to kind of like. And what I worry about is always like, we've talked about this before. It's like this can be used. That weapon can be used for good and for bad.
Yeah, of course. Well, see, it's already being used for bad all the time. So,
You're right. You're right.
I mean, I'm not advocating more federal spending, just saying like, just add some strings. Like there's already plenty of strings. Why not add some more strings? Yeah. I mean, there is, could it go wrong? Yeah. But I think it's still worth taking the chance, just because it's not like if you refrain from pushing from some good strings, that stops anybody else from pushing from bad strings.
So it's a good
So like another thing. So starting in the 60s, there's actually some weird federal rules that require, like if you're going to go and get this federal money, you need to go and have community engagement. And community engagement are basically like these horrible complainers who show up at meetings and no one should ever listen to them. So if you just say, that stuff about community engagement, yeah, actually, we no longer do we care one bit whether there's any community engagement. And community engagement doesn't really mean a random or a typical person in the community gets engaged. It means that the most angry, dogmatic, hateful people then go and say, now the world must listen to me and my wonderful thoughts about how Harry the Bird must be considered all the time. All right. So yes, community engagement.
They have a low cost of time too.
I mean, like more generally, whenever people say, well, we should go and let people sue for this problem. And it's like, look, think about people that how many of them would sue for almost anything? It's like no normal, emotionally stable person would sue for anything short of loss of a hand. just the idea, yeah, I'm going to sue that guy. That sounds terrible and it'll ruin my life. And like, it'll just like go on and on. And like, what are the odds? So like, who does go and sue? Like, they're emotionally unstable people who are like hypersensitive, and letting people sue basically just says, yeah, we think that it's really important to give a lot of power to hypersensitive, neurotic people. So yeah, ridiculous.
Yeah, I agree. So let me ask you another question. Like, so I think that the probably what I see the limit of only talking about housing deregulation and not talking about deregulation in the broader context. And I know you can't do everything, but if I assume that in a world where you win, like, right, where all the YIMBY actually kind of, you get what you want, and their housing deregulation, all the ones at the local level that matters, the accumulation of you get what you want. The world would look like, there are a lot of places that would look more dense. But that requires a lot of other things. Like, you need to build more sewage. You need to build, I don't know, like ways to avoid like traffic. So like, you need to actually sell the idea of price surging or paying for roads or whatever, right? It seems to me that if you don't also address these veto points, you're going to have a problem. So you're going to deregulate, but not be able to deliver on the overall vision that you want.
Right. Like, I'll just start with a slogan: I'll take what I can get.
Yeah, no, I agree.
All right. So look, we do have very simple, demonstrably true ways to go and solve, not just remedy, problems of road congestion, parking congestion. And it's just, for step one, charge a price greater than zero.
No, I agree.
Raise it to a freaking penny at least. But secondly, keep raising it until the congestion problem has been solved. Right now, I realize that this is another hard sell. And my honest view is that it would just be better to deregulate and just accept worse traffic and worse parking, because these problems, though they are annoying, they aren't nearly as bad as the trouble that we're having.
Maybe we'd finally get flying cars.
Yeah, maybe. That one's a real ask. But yeah, so ultimately, I just say, look, the ideal is we go and deregulate, and then we've got congestion pricing, and like, it's also privatized education while we're at it. But this is one where the book is controversial enough. Now, in terms of things like sewage and water and all that stuff, I don't talk about it. It's like, right now we got a system in place which is tolerable and has been around for 100 years, and which is just the government has property taxes, and they use the property taxes to pay for this stuff. All right, fine. So I'm not a fan. Could be done privately. But to go and say we shouldn't deregulate housing.
Oh, no. That's not what I'm saying.
Yeah, I know.
I'm saying it's just like
far less wise people than yourself might think that. So,
but I think actually we should deregulate. And actually, as you were talking, I was also thinking that actually the problem of actually getting like a suboptimal, we would be getting an outcome that's better than the outcome we have now anyway. But the suboptimal kind of outcome compared to what we could get, right, if everything fell in places, would only apply to a few places. Because there's actually, cities like Denver, which this is not New York, San Francisco. All these cities would benefit from housing deregulation, because not everyone who wants to move from, say, the Rust Belt has to move to San Francisco. Oh, yeah. You can actually increase your wage premium quite dramatically if you just move to actually a smaller city than these big one that we think about, right? And the price is still artificially too high, and they wouldn't automatically face, if there were more houses, it wouldn't necessarily mean enormous density to the point that you would face. So I'm talking me out of my own criticism. So
yeah.
I actually think that housing deregulation is probably one of the most important issue. And it's just not one of, this is probably the best way to get more economic growth in this country, which to me is like, it's not just, important for wealth accumulation, but it's like ethical, because we get so many good things with economic growth. So
sort of, circling back to the beginning, one of the main motivations, why did I do this book? did this book because after going and reading the research, I think that housing regulation is the second most destructive set of government policies that we see in the first world anyway.
The first one being?
The first one being immigration.
Oh, yeah.
So, like if you just say, all right, so the world that we have, the world that we would have without government regulation, the difference in the wealth of the world in those two scenarios. So, so I did open borders first because I think that restrictive immigration is the worst one. It is the most disruptive. And then I did housing second because I think that it's second most.
Mm-hmm.
Right, so,
and
combine it with, I felt like I understood it well enough to really do a great book on it. Nuclear power is another one where I think the evidence is very strong, but I just feel like I'd have to spend a couple years really understanding how electricity works, like that. Like, does it work again? Like, is a turbine? What's a turbine exactly?
Well, I mean, energy deregulation and the fact that there's so many people who think that a better world is one where we consume less energy. That's a very important topic, in my opinion.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, I don't understand energy and its detail well, but that I know.
But you know that you like having a car.
Yeah. A car and electricity. Yes. And I would do very poorly in an end of the world scenario. If there's I want to be dead, because me without the internet is just like, but I have a last question.
Your level of personality, so you're going to have to survive on that.
So I have a last question. So if you had to correct the most important mistaken claim that people make on this topic, what would it be?
Gee, I mean, honestly, given the evidence we have, I think the most mistaken view that is out there is that radical deregulation wouldn't do much to housing prices. Mm-hmm. Would not. So leave it this way: the error is that housing deregulation would not reduce housing prices a lot, because the truth is that housing deregulation would reduce it a lot. This might seem like an obvious point, but like I said, like 2/3 of people surveyed in the U.S. are in denial, right? And they think we're the ideologues, right? Yeah. So this is common sense. Go and talk to any economist of any political persuasion who works on this, and ask them, and are you like it's going to be really hard to find a guy that agrees with you. It's not ideology; it's common sense plus science plus just having like the willingness to go and say, the fact that someone's getting rich on something doesn't mean it's bad.
And it's ethical too.
Yeah, yes.
And so everyone,
honestly, when I go and talk to people that are in the industry, and I just say, look, thank you for doing what you do, because I only have to write about the stupid regulation, but you have to live under it. I mean, the way that regulators treat developers like criminals, it's like, actually look in a mirror. You're the bad guy. These people that they're going and doing something really great. And again, there are some markets where I can understand why someone might say, oh, well, you're just, you're going and harming the world by making money. You're just going and trying to sell cigarettes. You don't care whether underage kids buy them. You're a jerk. You're making people smell bad. Their family members will be upset. And like my kids started smoking, I wouldn't say, thank God for the cigarette companies. I just wouldn't. So it's like, all right, well, it's a little more complicated, but this is one where it's like they're doing something awesome. They're doing something they're building a product that we all want. It's something that the children need to have a home. Why are you getting in the way of this? Stop.
Stop.
Let them do their job. They're fine people making a very valuable product that you really can't argue with its merits. So get out of the way and let people build stuff.
I agree. And this is why I think everyone should buy Baby Build, The Science and Ethics of Housing Regulation by Bryan Caplan and Adi Brazi.
Yeah, Blanze.
And it's published by the Cato Institute.
Yes, it is.
So thank you. I mean, it's really, I just can't praise this book enough. It looks fantastic. I mean, I like the immigration one, but I think I got even more out of this one. So thank you, Bryan.
My pleasure. Thank you, Vera. Always a pleasure.